Okay, thank you very much, Todd. I want to first of all say that I'm honored that you selected my poem out of the possible millions of poems in the ether. So, thank you very much for finding something interesting in the work. My name is Roger Hecht, and the poem I'm going to read is called Villanelle. The sun sinks past the great beyond, or at least beyond the horizon. It sets aflame the skin of Jennings Pond, a red and molten blue reflection stirred only by the misstep of a heron. The sun sinks, and beyond, deep in the trees, young coyotes hunker till their midnight song sets aflame the skin of Jennings Pond, and tears my ears toward that direction. Our cat unwittingly wandered into teeth and terror in the great beyond that summer night. Their meal, our grief, and so on. The trees turned their heads, now their leaves turn on, and set aflame the skin of Jennings Pond. A red and yellow and rust pointillist explosion that draws us to the jaws of their oblivion. Our joy and delight till the sun sinks, the great beyond, and all aflame the skin of Jennings Pond. That's a really good question. It's in a lot of ways it's kind of hard to answer concretely because so many different things inspire poems. Sometimes it's a dream. I've had some really kind of funky dreams that I keep a dream journal, and some of those dreams have worked their ways into poems. Sometimes they come out of specific experiences. Although I don't consider myself a confessional poet, that is, I don't constantly make my life story the subject of my work. Sometimes it's just a really interesting phrase that I hear. A friend of mine emailed me 3 words that he saw in a Wikipedia entry about Eggo waffles, and Americans in your audience will recognize Eggo waffles, and it was called Notable Eggo Shortages. And I just thought that was so funny that I wrote a poem imagining all the different moments in history where there were notable Eggo shortages. Of course, none of it's real, but it was a lot of fun to write. This poem, Villanelle, came out in part because I was very interested in writing in traditional forms, and the villanelle is a French form, and you'll notice that it has these repeating lines. The first line and the last third line of the first stanza repeat as the final line of the subsequent stanzas in alternating order, and then they're repeated again in the concluding stanza. And so forms are interesting challenges. I like to call them enabling constraints, because you have to think about how you use these lines, or how you might use rhyme, or how you might use metrical patterns. It makes you write differently, and it kind of makes you think differently. You put yourself in a box, and then you have to write yourself out of the box. The subject matter of the poem, there is a Jennings Pond. It's a state park up the road from where I used to live in upstate New York, a little town called Danby. And I would walk my dog there, lived there for about 15 years, and so I wanted to write a poem. I've tried to write poems about Jennings Pond. I think this is the most successful one. And yes, I did have a cat eaten by coyotes, and very curiously, at night during the summer, almost like clockwork at midnight, it's like you flicked a switch, and all of a sudden the coyotes start howling. It was a pretty interesting, remarkable thing to experience. Unfortunately, some of my cats didn't come home and probably made their way into those coyotes' mouths. So yeah, there's a lot of things inspire poems. Um, I suppose, I mean, it varies for different poems. I mentioned earlier the idea of trying to write in forms. I wasn't trained in my university education to write in poetic forms. Free verse is sort of the default mode of most American poetry, I think. But because I teach creative writing classes, my students were interested in it, so I would give myself the assignment of trying to write in as many forms as I could, so that I become better able to teach other people how to do it. And so I kind of gave myself a challenge, and the challenge was to write in forms, and that kind of, and by forms I mean things like the Villanelle or the sonnet, which of course everybody knows, the 14 lines and the iambic pentameter and the rhyme scheme. There's a really lovely form called a sestina. A little bit hard to explain in a short amount of time, but it involves having 6 end words. That is, each line ends with a word, with a specific word that repeats as the end word, changing in a very particular way. And again, it's a fun challenge to try and write sentences that will end with those end words. And so yeah, I'll sometimes give myself assignments. I'm very interested in found poetry, that is, using found text. It might be a newspaper article. It could be well, in this case, I was using liner notes from record albums. I wanted to create a poem using only the language that was found in the liner notes on the back of a record album jacket. And to make it more interesting to myself, or more of a challenge, they were acrostics, which is another form where the first letter of each line spells out something. And in this case, it spelled out the name of the performer and the name of the album. So they're word puzzles. I guess I'm very interested in the idea of kind of creating word puzzles. But then again, I may have see an interesting statement or a line in a newspaper story, and that statement becomes the starting point for just wherever my imagination takes me. I'll sort of start with that sentence and see where it goes from there. So there's a lot of interesting kind of fun exploration. Well, I think the idea of, one of the things you may have noticed in the Villanelle is imagery. I think images are learning how to write images is very important. So I think one tip for writing poetry is to, go someplace. It could be outside. It could be in your room. It could be, once the pandemic is over and we get to go out to public places again, like cafes, to simply observe everything as closely as you can and record those observations, even minutia, such as the light glinting off a coffee spoon, or the fact that your cafe table is on uneven feet and rocks a little bit, could be really interesting details that can add to the atmosphere of a poem. Giving yourself assignments, I'm going to write a sonnet today, I'm going to write a Villanelle today, are all interesting ways to get started. There's wonderful prompts online. There's a lot of websites that just list prompts. Go out and write a poem about something that you appreciate. If you appreciate coffee, write a poem praising your cup of coffee. Or think of a memory that happened of an event that happened when you were 6, and using that, recalling a memory can be a great launching pad for starting a poem. Um, well, I think the first thing I would say is I think a lot of poets who write about poetry write about their craft and how to read poetry will focus on the idea that it does take a little bit of time. That is, you don't want to just kind of rush through it, and if the story isn't immediately clear or you don't get it, I'm putting "get it" in scare quotes, don't let that put you off. I think the first thing is to read it out loud, because a poem is not simply a little story. The poet is working with the sounds of words and the rhythm of language, and that's part of the pleasure of the poem, is to just hear how the words sound, how the word sounds come together. Rhyme is part of it, but there's interesting devices like alliteration and consonants and all kinds of different rhythmic tricks that poets use. I would call your attention to Amanda Gorman, who gave the inaugural poem for President Joe Biden's inauguration. There are wonderful rhythms and sounds and language tricks going on in that poem, in addition to the sort of the larger optimistic message about personal and political empowerment. So pay attention to the sounds of the poem. And even if a poem doesn't make sense, like in a logical sense, it's kind of making sense in a poetic sense. And it might not even be that important to get the poem, but to just kind of coast on it a little bit. I know that might sound a little bit obscure in a way, but sometimes the poem isn't meant to be gotten, but to be experienced. Oh my goodness, there's so I give a shout to my good friend poet Becky Burkett, my wife Joan Marcus, who's a memoirist and an essayist, and my favorite poet that I'm reading right now. You all should look her up. Her name is Diane Seuss.